There continues to be a lot of discussion about the performance of SCHD following its reconstitution that took place earlier this year. Following the changes to its holdings back in late March, which included adding more consumer staples and energy stocks, its share price growth has been pretty lackluster. This isn't anything new. A lot of people here on YouTube and websites like Seeking Alpha have been talking about it. Despite the reconstitution happening in March, its share price underperformance only started back in late April, which was less than 4 months ago. But despite SCHD having a cult-like following, it really didn't take long for a lot of people to turn against this ETF and start looking for alternatives. Now, I've always said that just about all of the major dividend growth funds out there are good. Whether we're talking about VIG, which is likely the most popular alternative to SCHD, or DGRO by iShares, SDY by State Street, or even something else. They're all slightly different, but any one of these alternatives is still a good pick. You can't lose money with any of these investments unless there's a bear market and you sell out right before you give it enough time to recover. And it's also long been my belief that even if you only invest for income, I would still recommend allocating just a little to a diversified dividend growth fund like SCHD. That's because the higher yielding investments typically don't offer much dividend growth, and your primary way of seeing your income grow with these higher yielding investments is by reinvesting your dividends. But you won't be reinvesting your dividends when you're actually living off of them. That's why holding a dividend growth ETF will ensure that your income keeps growing when you do reach that point of when you're actually living off dividends. If you're earning $8,000 a month and you're more than comfortable with living off $6,000 a month and you happen to be 80 years old, then that's a good example of when a dividend growth ETF really isn't necessary. But I have been pretty surprised at just how fast people were willing to dump SCHD because of its share price underperformance, which again only started less than 4 months ago. Especially considering that SCHD does offer some things that you don't get with any of the alternatives that exist. A lot of people either don't know this, or I personally think they're putting too much emphasis on share price gains instead of dividends. So I want to highlight what some of those unique aspects of SCHD are that I think people should think about before dumping this ETF. First, the Schwab ETF has always offered the highest yield, by far, compared to VIG or any of the other dividend growth funds. That's exactly how it was designed. SCHD intentionally holds the highest yielding stocks that pay qualified dividends with good track records. That would include more consumer discretionary and utility holdings, not exactly fast growers, and forgoing more tech stocks. Right now, SCHD comes with a yield of nearly 3.7%. If we compare that to VIG, that ETF only has a 1.7% yield. You're getting paid twice as much income for your investment dollar compared to its closest competitor. DGRO is a little better at 2.13%, but it's still nowhere close to the Schwab fund. Even the Vanguard High Yield ETF, ticker VYM, which is supposed to prioritize higher yielding holdings, only yields 2.55%. If you haven't noticed by watching the other videos on my channel, I always like to prioritize higher dividends compared to share price growth. I don't invest in anything that continuously falls in share price, but all of my other holdings either grow in share price or they're pretty flat. If your goal is to live off dividends and not have to rely on selling shares of your positions, then I have to ask, why is now all of a sudden share price much more important than dividend payout? It makes more sense to focus on dividend growth and safety. It's not that I think you shouldn't care at all about share price growth, but if SCHD can continue to deliver the same high yield and the same high dividend growth, then I don't see why so many people should have an issue with this fund. That brings me to point number 2, which is that SCHD's dividend growth is also unmatched by any of its alternatives. Their dividend growth rate, as of the making of this video, is currently 8.58%. If we compare that to the Vanguard Dividend Appreciation ETF, their dividend growth is only 4.92%. That's not too bad, but it's nowhere near as good as SCHD. And I'll show you this in a little bit, but imagine holding both of these two ETFs for decades. The amount of lack in dividend growth in VIG is going to become extremely apparent when looking at total returns. So not only does the Schwab ETF offer a higher yield right now, but it also offers better long-term dividend growth. With that in mind, there's a really important point that needs to be made here. If it's your goal to live off dividends alone without having to sell shares, you will achieve that much faster with SCHD than if you invest in VIG or any of the alternatives. We can see that using a dividend reinvestment calculator. Let's assume you invest $10,000 in SCHD today and you invest $5,000 every year going forward. You want $50,000 per year in dividends to live off of. Entering all the information we discussed, like its current dividend yield and dividend growth rate, as well as a mediocre 6% yearly increase in share price, you'll see that you'll earn $50,000 in dividends every year starting in year 26. Now, if we do the same for VIG, entering all the information we discussed, but with 9% average share price appreciation, the results are pretty different. When we run the calculator, this is when we see how dramatically different the returns are for the slower dividend growth. You wouldn't reach $50,000 per year in dividends at year 26. And in fact, this calculator isn't even showing when you'd reach $50,000 per year. After year 50, you're still only making $15,000 per year. That slower compounding dividend growth really shows how dramatically different these two funds are. Now, you may have noticed though that your account balance after 50 years would be significantly higher than with SCHD. But this goes back to my original point. If you're more interested in selling shares of positions instead of living off dividends, why even hold VIG or any dividend holding for that matter? Getting back to the idea of trading SCHD for an alternative, also think about what'll happen if you do sell out of SCHD from a tax perspective. If you're holding this ETF in a non-retirement account, which is a good place to hold this ETF because of its qualified dividends, then selling it will be a taxable event if you do have a gain. Depending on how much of this ETF you own, as well as how long you've held it, this could turn into a sizable tax burden. With that in mind, I just don't think a few months of share price underperformance is worth taking on that burden yet. It's also ridiculous to claim that SCHD is done for, or things are never going to get better, like I'm seeing some clickbait articles and YouTube videos suggest. Remember, this ETF reconstitutes every year, and we're going to see updates to it in 6 months. So to anyone who wants to replace this ETF for an alternative, I'll say this. It's not a terrible thing to replace SCHD with VIG or something different. But just remember, you're going to be giving up all that faster dividend growth. That's going to matter decades down the road. If you're okay with selling shares of your holdings, then that's a personal choice. But for those who want to someday live off dividends without having to sell shares, SCHD still appears to be the best pick among dividend growth ETFs. If things do get worse, then that could mean picking a new fund may become appropriate. But I still believe it's just too soon to come to the conclusion that SCHD should be abandoned. But let me know your thoughts in the comments, and with that being said, that's going to wrap up today's video. If you'd like to connect with me and see what's inside of my own high-yielding dividend portfolio, then feel free to check me out over on Patreon. You'll be notified when I make trades, and you'll get access to our Discord with other high-yielding investors. Thanks again for watching. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe if you want more high-yielding investment content. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you all have a great day.